The night opens over the ancient forests of Europe, and in the quiet hum of distant centuries, a name rises from the mist like a forgotten echo: the Merovingians. Their story begins not with a coronation or a battle, but with a whisper, one that slips between history and myth, between what we are taught to remember and what the world has worked very hard to forget. For centuries, their legacy has hovered at the edge of recorded history, half lit and half lost, as though someone has been slowly dimming the flame that once illuminated their past. And yet, no matter how much time passes, the embers of their mystery continue to glow. Imagine a dynasty so strange, so wrapped in symbolism and sacred authority, that even medieval chroniclers struggled to understand them. These rulers were not merely kings. They were believed to be the chosen, the anointed, the bearers of a bloodline that flowed with something more than lineage. It carried power. The Merovingians did not need crowns of gold to signal their authority. Their long, uncut hair served as a symbol older and more enigmatic than any crown. It was said their hair contained their very essence, the divine spark that separated them from common rulers. And it is from this spark that their secrets began. Step closer, and the fog of forgotten history begins to part just enough to reveal shapes, fragments of stories, scattered relics, and legends that refuse to die. The Merovingians ruled the early Frankish kingdom more than a millennium ago, but their influence seems disproportionate for a dynasty that officially ended in the 8th century. They founded cities, shaped laws, and set the stage for what would one day become modern France. But behind the visible world of politics and power, there was always something else, something quieter, something hidden, as though the Merovingians themselves were a veil draped over an even older mystery. Throughout the Middle Ages, writers spoke of them with an uneasy fascination. Their kings were said to communicate with spirits, to heal with a touch, to see beyond the physical world. Their ancestry was not traced merely to warlords or chieftains, but to beings who stepped between myth and humanity. Some sources whispered that their bloodline came from the sea, from a creature or figure whose identity was deliberately obscured. Others linked them to even older traditions, Celtic, Germanic, and perhaps something more. The church chroniclers recorded the stories, but always with caution, as though they were describing something dangerous. And then, gradually, the chroniclers fell silent. It is this silence that speaks the loudest. Why would a dynasty so influential, so embedded in the foundations of European identity, be pushed so quickly and quietly into obscurity? How did a line of kings who once commanded both fear and devotion become reduced to a footnote? Why did certain histories evaporate, certain artifacts vanish, and certain genealogies become blurred? It is here, in this quiet erasure, that the true mystery begins. In recent decades, interest in the Merovingians has returned, not from royal historians, but from researchers, archaeologists, cryptographers, and those who study ancient esoteric traditions. Their curiosity is not fueled by simple nostalgia, but by the discovery of scattered pieces that, when placed together, suggest a puzzle of enormous scale. From medieval manuscripts to encoded maps, from relics recovered in monasteries to DNA studies conducted on ancient remains, a new picture is emerging, one that suggests the Merovingian story is far from over. In fact, it may only now be coming into focus. Consider this. The idea of sacred bloodlines, long dismissed as mythology, has regained relevance as genetic science uncovers ancient migrations and forgotten relationships between dynasties. Patterns once dismissed as legend suddenly align with biological reality. Old symbols found on Merovingian artifacts resemble those found in regions far beyond early medieval France, hinting at connections across continents and cultures. And as researchers begin to test remains attributed to Merovingian rulers, surprising markers have appeared, genetic threads that tie their story to lineages once thought unrelated. Each new discovery raises more questions than answers. Some researchers argue that the Merovingians guarded knowledge that predated Christianity, knowledge that threatened established religious authority. Others believe that certain esoteric societies, Templars, Rosicrucians, later secret orders, saw the Merovingians not simply as ancient kings, but as custodians of a powerful lineage tied to the concept of the Holy Grail. Not a chalice, not an object, but a living bloodline. A lineage that symbolized continuity, wisdom, and perhaps something deeper, a bridge between human ancestry and the divine. For centuries, such ideas were categorically dismissed. Today they are being re-examined, not because belief has changed, but because evidence has begun to surface. Strange inscriptions, unexplained patterns, and genetic anomalies have revived questions long buried. And with each new discovery, the line between history and myth grows thinner. As we begin this journey, imagine peeling back the layers of a medieval tapestry, each thread revealing another beneath it. The Merovingians were not merely rulers. They were symbols of power, of mystery, of something Europe has not yet fully understood. Their story is not a simple rise and fall. It is a coded legacy, one that stretches from ancient forests and stone temples to modern laboratories and DNA sequencing machines. Tonight, we walk into that code. We walk into the whispers that history tried to silence. And as we unravel their lost story, piece by piece, we step closer to a truth that has remained hidden for more than 1,000 years. The truth of the bloodline. The truth of the long-haired kings. The truth that waits, even now, behind the veil of history. To understand the mystery of the Merovingians, we must return to a world that was still forming itself out of the ruins of the Roman Empire. A world where chaos, migration, and ambition swirled together like storm clouds over the European landscape. The 5th century was a time when borders were drawn and erased in the same breath, when tribes rose and vanished like dust on forgotten roads, and when new powers emerged from unexpected places. Among these rising forces were the Franks, a confederation of tribes that would eventually shape the destiny of Western Europe. But within the ranks of these tribes was one lineage that stood apart even then, a family destined to become both rulers and legends, the Merovingians. Their story begins with a leader named Merovec, or Merovius in the Latinized form, a figure whose origins are wrapped in fog, recorded more in symbols than in certainty. According to early chronicles, Merovec was not born in the ordinary way. His conception is described in a strange and haunting tale. His mother, already pregnant by her human husband, was said to have encountered a sea creature, a bestia neptuni, a beast of Neptune, during a ritual bathing in the waters of the North Sea. When she returned from the water, she carried within her the child who would become the ancestor of the Merovingian kings. This story was not treated as a simple myth. Medieval writers recorded it with a seriousness that suggests they did not see it as mere fantasy, but as a clue to something sacred, something otherworldly, something that set this family's blood apart. Even today, historians debate the meaning of this tale. Was it a symbolic story meant to express a merging of cultures? A reference to an ancient deity? A misunderstood retelling of an older myth? Or could it be a metaphor for something hidden within the bloodline? Something so unusual that chroniclers could only express it through the language of myth? Whatever the truth may be, the legend succeeded in one thing. It marked Merovec and his descendants as fundamentally different. From Merovec came Childeric, and from Childeric came Clovis, the most famous and transformative figure of the early Frankish world. It was Clovis who united the Frankish tribes under a single banner, forged alliances, conquered rivals, and established a kingdom that stretched across what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. And yet, even as history celebrates him as a military and political genius. A deeper layer of his story reveals a strange duality. One foot in the world of realpolitik, and one foot in a more mystical realm that surrounded the Merovingian identity. Clovis's conversion to Christianity, often portrayed as a straightforward political maneuver, becomes far more intriguing when examined in light of the Merovingian mystique. Unlike many rulers who converted for alliances or legitimacy, Clovis's decision appears to have been driven by something personal, almost fated. Chroniclers describe a battlefield scene where Clovis, facing defeat, invoked the Christian god and suddenly turned the tide. Yet behind this story lies an older pattern. Merovingian leaders were often portrayed as spiritually sensitive, as though they moved through the world guided by unseen forces. Thus, Clovis's conversion becomes more than a historical turning point. It becomes a moment in which two spiritual traditions intersected, the old, enigmatic aura of the Merovingian line and the rising force of Christianity. But even after embracing the new faith, the Merovingians retained their symbols of sacred kingship. Their long, uncut hair, a sign of divine authority, not vanity, remained untouched. Their rituals remained unique, distinct from those of the church or of neighboring tribes. Their court was said to be filled with seers, dream interpreters, and secret traditions passed through generations. These kings ruled not only with swords, but with symbols. Their presence carried weight, not just because they commanded armies, but because people believed something beyond mortal power flowed through them. This blend of politics, myth, and sacred authority created a dynasty unlike any other in Europe. While other early medieval rulers legitimized themselves through conquest, inheritance, or religious endorsement, the Merovingians seemed to possess legitimacy that required no explanation, something ancient, unquestionable, inherited from origins older than the kingdom they ruled. Even enemies feared them, not merely because of their warriors, but because of the aura surrounding their name. Yet with all the influence they held, the Merovingians existed in a fragile balance. Their power depended not on bureaucracy or institutions, but on a belief in the sanctity of their bloodline. When that belief was strong, their rule was unquestioned. But as centuries passed, forces emerged that sought to challenge, replace, or diminish this sacred lineage. The church grew stronger, rival noble families rose to prominence, and political structures shifted. The Merovingian mystique, once a source of undeniable authority, slowly became a threat to those who wished to centralize power. But before their fall, before the Carolingians pushed them from the throne, before their history was rewritten and their mysteries buried, the Merovingians left an imprint on Europe that cannot be erased. They laid foundations for leadership, law, and culture. They shaped the early concept of European kingship. They carved out territories that remain central to modern national identities. Their symbols, their seals, their genealogies, these would be copied, modified, or quietly absorbed by the rulers who followed them. Yet what sets them apart is not simply their political legacy, but the intangible atmosphere that surrounds their name. No other dynasty of early medieval Europe has generated such enduring fascination. No other family has been wrapped in so many legends, so many theories, so many whispered stories passed through centuries. And as the world enters the era of genetic exploration and historical re-examination, the Merovingian story becomes newly alive, its mysteries rising once more from the depths of forgotten chronicles. To trace their origin is to trace the beginning of a question about lineage, power, myth, and the blurred line between history and something older, something deeper. Their roots reach not only into the soil of early France, but into the symbolic consciousness of Europe itself. And as we continue our journey, each layer we uncover reveals another beneath it. The Merovingians did not simply emerge in history. They emerged in myth, in belief, and in mystery. And it is from this potent mixture that their story begins, not as a straightforward chronicle, but as the opening chapter of a much larger and more enigmatic truth. Among the most enduring and enigmatic symbols of the Merovingians was their long hair, a feature that for modern eyes may seem purely aesthetic, but for those who lived under their rule, it was a sign of something far deeper. Unlike kings who wore crowns, helmets, or ceremonial robes to signify authority, the Merovingians carried their power visibly in strands of hair that flowed uncut from their heads. These were not simply locks of flesh and protein. They were symbols, repositories of a mystical authority that marked them as sacred, set apart from ordinary men. To cut the hair of a Merovingian was, in legend, to sever the connection between king and cosmos, to diminish the divine force that supposedly coursed through their veins. The very idea of hair as a vessel of power is strange to modern sensibilities, but in the context of early medieval Europe, it carried profound significance. The origins of this symbolism are murky, blending pagan ritual with emerging Christian thought, and perhaps even older, forgotten traditions. Among the Germanic tribes, long hair was often a mark of strength, honor, and status. Warriors were recognized by their flowing locks. The uncut hair of a chief was a testament to his endurance and lineage. But the Merovingians transformed this symbolism into something uniquely royal, turning what had been a tribal marker into a symbol of sacred kingship. Their hair was not merely long. It was consecrated, revered, almost holy. Chroniclers noted that even as these kings wielded swords and commanded armies, their hair alone signaled legitimacy. It was an aura that could not be replicated, a line of power that could not be claimed through conquest alone. Legend suggests that this sacred hair was tied to their bloodline in ways that went beyond mere ancestry. Some scholars have argued that the hair itself was considered a vessel of divine essence, a kind of living archive that carried the energy of their forebears. In an era when literacy was scarce and written records fragile, it is possible that the hair functioned as a symbolic continuity of the dynasty, a visible thread linking each ruler to Merovec, to the mysterious sea-born ancestor whose story had been whispered across generations. To see a Merovingian king in public was to witness a living connection to both history and myth, a presence imbued with a sense of the sacred. Rituals surrounding the hair were no less significant. When a Merovingian child was born into the line of succession, the hair was often nurtured and cared for as a sacred object. There are accounts of special oils, ceremonies, and oaths associated with the hair, emphasizing that it was more than mere appearance. It was the embodiment of legitimacy. During coronations, the hair was sometimes displayed or manipulated in ways that marked the transition of power, symbolizing the transfer of spiritual authority. Scholars have noted parallels with other ancient cultures that venerated hair as a source of power, from the biblical Samson to Celtic chieftains, suggesting that the Merovingians tapped into a deep cultural memory, a continuity of sacred symbolism that transcended their own era. This reverence for hair extended into the political realm, creating both fear and respect. Rivals understood that attacking a Merovingian's legitimacy required more than military might. It required undermining the sacred narrative that surrounded them. In some accounts, the Carolingians, who eventually replaced the Merovingians, went to great lengths to control or obscure these symbols, cutting the long hair of dethroned kings to signify the end of their divine authority. These acts were not merely physical. They were statements of cosmic and cultural power, designed to sever the connection between the old kings and the sacred forces that had once supported them. Yet the hair was not the only symbol, though it may have been the most visible. Jewelry, amulets, and regalia carried esoteric meaning, often inscribed with symbols that hinted at a knowledge only the initiates understood. Combined with the hair, these elements created a kind of living iconography, a visual language of power that communicated authority even to those who could not read or write. Every strand, every braid, every adornment reinforced the idea that the Merovingians were unlike other rulers, that they operated under rules not entirely of this world. Modern interpretations have also explored the possibility that the hair served a practical purpose in addition to its symbolic one. In a world without the record-keeping and documentation of later centuries, physical markers of identity were crucial. Long, uncut hair could function as an identifier, signaling the continuation of a lineage that was as much spiritual as it was political. It may have also carried a psychological weight, inspiring awe in subjects and fear in enemies, reinforcing the perception that these kings were protected by forces beyond human understanding. The fascination with Merovingian hair did not fade with the fall of the dynasty. Chroniclers of subsequent centuries, as well as esoteric writers and conspiracy theorists, continue to emphasize its importance, embedding it into a narrative of mystery that persists today. The long hair became emblematic of the dynasty itself, a shorthand for sacred blood, hidden knowledge, and a lineage that could never be fully erased. Even as the Carolingians rose, even as monasteries rewrote histories and documents vanished, the idea of the hair as a vessel of power remained, preserved in legend, art, and whispered stories. In essence, the long hair of the Merovingians represents more than a historical curiosity. It is a window into the worldview of an age where physical and spiritual power were intertwined, where symbolism conveyed authority as surely as armies or laws. Through this simple yet profound marker, the Merovingians projected an identity that was at once human and divine, political and mystical. It is through understanding this singular feature that we begin to grasp the true nature of their kingship, a nature that cannot be separated from the myths, the rituals, and the esoteric traditions that surrounded them. And so, as we follow the threads of history, legend, and symbolism, the long hair becomes more than a visual detail. It becomes a key. It is a symbol of continuity, of sacred inheritance, and of secrets yet to be fully revealed. In the strands of each Merovingian king, we find a bridge between worlds, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the mortal and the divine. It is to trace the lineage of mystery itself, and a step closer to the hidden truths that have captivated imaginations for over a millennium. Among the most enduring mysteries surrounding the Merovingians is the legend of the Grail, a concept so deeply entwined with European myth that it has inspired centuries of speculation, art, and devotion. But when one looks closer, the Grail may not have been a cup at all, nor an artifact to be sought on perilous quests. For the Merovingians, it is said, the Grail was not an object, but a lineage, a bloodline infused with a hidden power that extended far beyond the temporal authority of kings. The very idea challenges the traditional narratives of history, suggesting that the Merovingians were more than mere rulers. They were custodians of sacred heritage, a living link between the divine and humanity. The roots of this notion stretch deep into both Celtic and early Christian traditions. Celtic myths describe sacred bloodlines and divine ancestry, tracing the power of kings to forces beyond the human realm. Similarly, early Christian mysticism held that certain families were chosen vessels, conduits through which divine will could manifest on earth. The Merovingians, sitting at the crossroads of these traditions, may have embodied both, the physical and the spiritual intertwined in a way that ordinary kings could never claim. Their supposed connection to the Grail, then, was not metaphorical alone. It was both symbolic and, according to some esoteric theorists, biological. Medieval texts, some obscure and many lost to time, hint at the significance of this bloodline. Chronicles from monasteries, glossed in marginal notes and codices, occasionally reference this saying real or royal blood in ways that are not fully explained. Later interpretations would twist these references into tales of a chalice and a quest, as seen in the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. Yet scholars of the esoteric suggest that these medieval stories may be allegorical retellings, coded in the language of legend to preserve knowledge about a living lineage that, for political and religious reasons, could not be spoken of openly. The Grail, then, becomes a cipher, a symbol pointing not to an object but to a hidden truth about ancestry, power, and divine inheritance. This interpretation gains depth when one considers the meticulous record-keeping and ritual practices of the Merovingians themselves. While their public authority was visible through conquest and rule, their private rites, often performed in secrecy or in the presence of trusted initiates, suggest a concern with preservation, of knowledge, of sanctity, and of lineage. Some chronicles hint at rituals involving relics, sacred spaces, and ceremonial oaths, all reinforcing the idea that the bloodline itself was the ultimate grail. It was a secret carefully guarded, whispered across generations, hidden in plain sight, and encoded in symbols that only the initiated could interpret. The connection between the Merovingians and later legendary orders further complicates the picture. The Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, and other secret societies that emerged in subsequent centuries are said by some researchers to have held knowledge of the Merovingian lineage, its significance, and its supposed powers. For these groups, the Grail was not a cup to be captured, but a bloodline to be protected, a lineage that contained ancient wisdom and spiritual authority. In this context, the stories of hidden kings, lost heirs, and clandestine guardianship acquire new meaning, suggesting a continuity of secrecy that stretches across centuries. It is tempting to dismiss these connections as fanciful speculation, yet patterns emerge that resist simple explanation. Symbols associated with the Merovingians, crosses, stars, and intricate geometric patterns, appear in the iconography of secret societies long after the dynasty's political fall. Manuscripts and maps preserved in private collections, often dismissed by mainstream historians as curiosities, hint at locations, rituals, and genealogies that align uncannily with Merovingian traditions. Whether one interprets these as coincidence or deliberate preservation, the effect is the same: a sense that the Merovingians were not merely kings, but custodians of knowledge, and that this knowledge was linked inseparably to their blood. Legends of the Grail itself, particularly in French lore, frequently return to themes of descent, inheritance, and hidden continuity. The concept of a pure line, one safeguarded against corruption, echoes in stories of lost heirs, secret marriages, and protected progeny. It is here that the boundary between history and myth blurs most dramatically. The Merovingians, in this light, are not simply a historical dynasty. They're the embodiment of a question. What is the value of a bloodline that carries not only genetic material, but symbolic and spiritual power? And, crucially, what happens when such a line is threatened or nearly erased? The idea that the Grail was a living bloodline also reframes our understanding of later European history. If the Merovingians were indeed custodians of this secret lineage, their apparent decline at the hands of the Carolingians may not have been a simple political maneuver, but part of a larger effort to suppress knowledge that was deemed dangerous or subversive. By displacing the Merovingians, controlling their symbols, and rewriting chronicles, subsequent rulers may have sought to sever the living link to a line that claimed both divine and temporal authority. It is a theory that, while speculative, casts familiar events: the rise of the Carolingians, the restructuring of European dynasties, in a new, shadowed light. Even in the modern era, traces of this interpretation persist. Esoteric scholars, genealogists, and even some genetic researchers have begun examining the possibility that remnants of the Merovingian lineage survive today, not as abstract myth, but as tangible, living connections. These studies, while controversial, suggest that the Grail's meaning may indeed have been misinterpreted for centuries. The Grail, in other words, may never have been lost. It may have simply been concealed, hidden in plain sight within the flow of blood and the continuity of family lines. As we move deeper into the mystery, it becomes clear that understanding the Merovingians and the Grail requires more than historical knowledge. It requires a willingness to explore symbols, legends, and interpretations that defy conventional logic. It is a journey into the overlapping worlds of myth and reality, science and spirituality, power and secrecy. To uncover the truth of the Merovingians is not merely to study kings and chronicles. It is to trace the lineage of an idea, to follow a thread of sacred inheritance through centuries of suppression, and to ask what it means when history itself conspires to keep a secret. In contemplating the Grail as a bloodline, we begin to see the Merovingians not as distant figures of the past, but as custodians of a living mystery, a secret that may yet ripple through generations, waiting to be recognized, understood, and perhaps even revealed. Their story is not merely the story of kings. It is the story of inheritance, of preservation, and of a hidden legacy that challenges the very way we think about history, power, and the unseen forces that shape our world. The rise of the Merovingians was extraordinary, yet as with many powerful lineages, their prominence eventually attracted opposition. History often tells the story as though their decline was inevitable, a simple matter of politics and conquest. But a closer examination suggests a more deliberate, almost systematic effort to suppress the dynasty's secrets and erase its influence. The Church, the emerging Carolingian rulers, and other political powers of the time may have recognized that the Merovingians were more than kings. They were symbols of a sacred lineage, a living authority that operated both in the physical realm and in the realm of belief. To dismantle that power required more than battle. It required the careful rewriting of history. By the late 7th and early 8th centuries, the Merovingian kings had become known as the Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings, a phrase that persists in historical accounts. On the surface, this seems a simple critique of their political ineffectiveness, but the term also served a subtler function. It delegitimized the dynasty's authority, framing the kings as weak and irrelevant, while paving the way for Carolingian ascendancy. What is striking is how consistently this narrative appears in chronicles written after the fact, suggesting not a neutral assessment, but a deliberate shaping of perception. To call a king a do-nothing ruler is to erase the centuries of influence, the sacred rituals, and the symbolic authority that made the Merovingians unique. The Carolingians, who replaced the Merovingians, were highly aware of the power of symbols. They did not merely conquer. They replaced, erased, and recoded the cultural memory of the dynasty they overthrew. Dethroned kings had their hair cut, a symbolic act that severed their perceived connection to divine authority. Sacred objects, relics, and manuscripts were confiscated, hidden, or destroyed. Even genealogies were rewritten or obscured, ensuring that the continuity of the Merovingian bloodline became difficult to trace. What emerges is a picture of calculated suppression, a methodical effort to contain not just a political threat, but a mystical one. This suppression was reinforced by the Church, which had grown increasingly powerful by this time. The Merovingians had been unusual in their relationship with Christianity. Clovis's conversion had aligned them with the Church, but subsequent kings often maintained secret rituals or pagan influences alongside their public Christian identity. This duality may have threatened a church seeking to centralize authority and define orthodoxy. By characterizing the Merovingians as ineffective or morally corrupt, ecclesiastical chroniclers could justify both the dynasty's replacement and the erasure of its sacred practices. The narrative constructed by these chroniclers persists today, yet traces of the original rituals, symbols, and beliefs continue to surface in obscure manuscripts, suggesting that the suppression was never entirely complete. Artifacts provide another clue to the deliberate concealment of the Merovingian legacy. Crowns, scepters, and seals that once marked their authority disappeared or were absorbed into other dynasties. Manuscripts that might have documented sacred rites or genealogies were scattered, hidden, or destroyed. Even the very locations of their royal tombs became uncertain, shrouded in mystery and legend. Scholars speculate that these actions were not random, but intentional, designed to prevent the public from recognizing the continuity of a bloodline thought too powerful, too dangerous, or too sacred to remain visible. This erasure created fertile ground for myths, rumors, and conspiracy theories. Stories of hidden heirs, secret treasures, and clandestine rituals began to circulate in whispers. By suppressing concrete evidence, the powers that be inadvertently preserved the aura of mystery that surrounds the Merovingians to this day. Each fragment of history that survives carries a tension between revelation and concealment, hinting at a reality far more complex than the simplified narrative of do-nothing kings. The deeper one looks, the more one senses that these kings were not simply passive figures swept aside by history. They were targets of a calculated campaign to hide what they truly represented. The tension between revealed history and suppressed truth also emerges in genealogical studies. Despite centuries of attempts to obscure their lineage, researchers have found tantalizing evidence that descendants of the Merovingians may have persisted, quietly integrated into European aristocracy. These claims, long dismissed by mainstream historians, gain new interest in the age of genetic analysis. If true, they suggest that the dynasty's power was never entirely extinguished. It was merely driven underground, surviving in hidden forms and protected by those who recognized its sacred significance. Even the narratives of prophecy played a role in this suppression. Prophecies surrounding the Merovingians, some attributed to medieval seers and others to later mystics, frequently predicted a restoration of their line or the emergence of a hidden king. These texts, often suppressed or hidden themselves, reinforce the idea that the Merovingians were perceived as a force that could not be ignored. Prophecy becomes a double-edged sword. It preserves the memory of the dynasty while simultaneously warning that its power must be contained, lest it disrupt the order established by the Carolingians and the Church. It is here, in the quiet interplay between erasure and preservation, that the true mystery of the Merovingians emerges. They were kings, yes, but their significance extended beyond politics. They embodied a sacred authority that could not be fully recorded, a lineage whose power was at once spiritual, symbolic, and hereditary. To suppress such a force required both violence and subtlety. The removal of kings from power, the destruction of documents, and the shaping of historical narratives to conceal truth behind legend. And yet, paradoxically, it is this very suppression that has made the Merovingians immortal in our imagination, as their secrets continue to tantalize, intrigue, and defy easy explanation. By examining the Merovingians through the lens of suppression, we begin to understand why their story is so compelling. History is not always neutral. Sometimes it is a battleground of memory, with a powerful attempt to erase what they fear. And in the case of the Merovingians, what was feared was not just a king, but a bloodline, a symbol, a sacred inheritance that may still ripple through the centuries. To uncover their story is to peel back layers of deliberate concealment and to confront the tension between what was recorded and what was hidden, a tension that defines the mystery of the long-haired kings even today. The Merovingians were more than kings. They were the subjects of prophecy, and in the medieval imagination, prophecy was not idle speculation, but a form of power, a way of seeing the future and understanding the currents of destiny. From the earliest centuries of their reign, The Merovingians were linked to predictions of both greatness and peril. Chroniclers, monks, and seers often hinted that these long-haired kings were part of a divine plan, that their bloodline carried significance far beyond politics, and that even their fall would be only temporary in the larger design of history. These prophecies added a layer of mystique, elevating them from rulers of men to figures of fate. One of the most enduring themes in these prophetic traditions is that of the hidden king, or the king in exile, a ruler whose true authority remains concealed until the proper moment. Legends circulated of Merovingian heirs who vanished from public view, safeguarded by loyal retainers, secret orders, or even supernatural forces. These stories were not simply entertainment. They were warnings, reflections of a medieval worldview in which kingship was tied to sacred timing and the alignment of cosmic forces. To disrupt or ignore these patterns was to risk chaos, both earthly and spiritual. Nostradamus, writing centuries later, would allude to lines of kings whose power persisted in secrecy, suggesting continuity despite apparent disappearance. While skeptics dismiss such references as vague or coincidental, historians and esoteric scholars note the recurring motifs: bloodlines that survive exile, rulers who emerge in times of crisis, and a sense that hidden wisdom accompanies the lineage. In the case of the Merovingians, these motifs suggest that prophecy was less about predicting random events and more about encoding knowledge of a sacred line whose influence could not be destroyed by conventional means. Medieval prophecies also describe the Merovingians as bearers of a dual power, temporal and spiritual. They were kings who ruled with swords, but also with symbols, rituals, and sacred blood. Some predictions describe rulers whose authority derives from divine inheritance rather than conquest, a legitimacy that cannot be contested by law or force. The tension between earthly power and sacred right is central to understanding both the allure and the danger of the Merovingian line. It is this duality that likely provoked the efforts to suppress their legacy, as the forces of church and state feared a power that could not be fully controlled or explained. The notion of prophecy extended beyond Europe itself. Legends hint at connections between the Merovingians and older, almost forgotten traditions of kingship that stretch back to the ancient Mediterranean and Celtic worlds. Some texts describe a knowledge of cycles, astronomical, spiritual, and political, that the Merovingians were believed to understand. These cycles were said to govern not only kingship but the fate of the lands they ruled, suggesting that the dynasty's authority was entwined with the very rhythm of history. Such interpretations blur the line between myth and empirical observation, hinting that prophecy was as much a code for understanding reality as it was a mystical vision. The survival of these prophecies was not accidental. Monasteries, crypts, and private collections preserve manuscripts that reference the Merovingians in symbolic, often cryptic language. Marginal notes, coded drawings, and obscure genealogical charts serve as vessels of hidden knowledge, ensuring that the lineage and its associated wisdom were not entirely lost, even in the face of political suppression. Over time, these documents became the source material for later scholars, mystics, and esotericists who interpreted them through the lens of secret knowledge, spiritual power, and the persistence of a sacred bloodline. Prophecies also intersected with the idea of the Grail, reframing the Merovingian bloodline as a living object of desire and protection. In this context, the hidden king becomes a custodian of a secret inheritance, a human vessel for knowledge and power that could survive centuries in concealment. The Grail, long misunderstood as a chalice, is revealed through this lens as a metaphor for continuity, wisdom, and divine authority encoded in a family line. Each prophecy that references a lost or hidden Merovingian heir reinforces this interpretation, suggesting that the dynasty's significance was never fully mortal, It transcended ordinary history. Even as the Merovingians were displaced, the echo of prophecy persisted. Chroniclers, poets, and later mystics ensured that the aura of expectation remained, hinting that the dynasty might one day reassert its presence, either politically, spiritually, or symbolically. This tension between concealment and revelation, disappearance and reemergence, creates a narrative that is as compelling as it is enigmatic. It is a story in which time itself seems to conspire to protect the secrets of a bloodline whose power could not be entirely extinguished. For modern observers, these prophecies are both tantalizing and confounding. Are they evidence of a genuine, long-hidden knowledge, or simply a medieval fascination with kingship and fate? The answer may lie somewhere in between. Even if the mystical aspects are interpreted symbolically, the consistency of these motifs across centuries suggests that the Merovingians were perceived by their contemporaries and by later generations as extraordinary figures, rulers whose significance could not be reduced to mere politics. The continued fascination with their bloodline, their hair, and the Grail may be a reflection of the enduring power of these prophetic narratives. In essence, prophecy acts as a bridge between the observable and the hidden, between the historical record and the esoteric undercurrent that defines the Merovingians. It transforms the dynasty from a chapter in a history book into a living mystery, one in which the past, present, and future are intertwined. Each tale of a hidden king, each cryptic manuscript, each whispered prediction adds a layer to a story that refuses to be confined by time. Through prophecy, we see the Merovingians not merely as rulers of men, but as custodians of a sacred design, a lineage whose significance extended beyond politics into the very fabric of fate. Theirs is a story of expectation and secrecy, of power and concealment, and it is this duality that has allowed their legacy to endure centuries after their formal rule ended. The dynasty's influence, cloaked in symbols, bloodlines, and esoteric knowledge, continues to ripple through history, inviting us to uncover what was once hidden and to ask what it truly means to guard a secret that spans time itself. Artifacts often tell stories that words alone cannot capture, and for the Merovingians, their relics carry a weight that is as much symbolic as it is historical. These objects, crowns, scepters, seals, manuscripts, and personal belongings, were not mere trappings of royal life. They were extensions of power, markers of legitimacy, and, in some interpretations, vessels of the sacred essence that the dynasty was believed to possess. Across centuries, many of these artifacts have disappeared, vanished under mysterious circumstances, or been absorbed into other collections, their meanings obscured. Each relic that survives offers a tantalizing glimpse into a lineage that, though politically diminished, never entirely vanished from the collective imagination. One of the most discussed Merovingian relics is the so-called treasure of the long-haired kings, a collection of ceremonial objects whose existence is documented in medieval inventories, but whose current whereabouts are uncertain. Crowns adorned with precious stones, delicate scepters etched with intricate symbols, and ceremonial rings that may have marked succession are all described in historical accounts. These objects were not only symbols of earthly authority, but also markers of sacred inheritance. Their designs often incorporate cryptic motifs, geometric patterns, and symbols reminiscent of older pagan traditions, suggesting that the Merovingians intentionally encoded meaning into their artifacts, a language of power readable only to those initiated into the mysteries of the line. Manuscripts associated with the Merovingians are equally enigmatic. Some contain genealogical charts tracing the lineage of the dynasty in ways that hint at hidden connections. Others preserve prayers, rituals, or esoteric knowledge intended for a select audience. Marginal notes, obscure diagrams, and coded passages hint at a worldview in which kingship, blood, and spirituality are inseparable. These texts were not intended for public consumption. They were carefully guarded, often housed in monasteries or private collections, ensuring that the knowledge embedded within remained shielded from those who might misuse it. Over time, as dynasties changed and manuscripts were dispersed, much of this knowledge was lost, yet enough fragments survived to spark curiosity and speculation even today. The disappearance of many Merovingian relics has fueled centuries of speculation. Some historians suggest they were destroyed during the Carolingian ascendancy, either to diminish the influence of the previous dynasty or to appropriate their symbolic authority. Others argue that objects were deliberately hidden, secreted away by loyal retainers, clergy, or esoteric societies, perhaps in the hope that the bloodline might one day reemerge. Legends abound of buried treasures, hidden crypts, and secret caches of ceremonial regalia, sometimes linked to the Grail myths, sometimes to the lineage itself. Each story reinforces the sense that the Merovingians were not merely rulers of men, but custodians of a power that could not be fully eradicated. Some relics appear to have survived under unexpected circumstances. Pieces of jewelry, seals, and fragments of ceremonial regalia have surfaced in European museums, private collections, or archaeological digs, often accompanied by enigmatic inscriptions or designs. These objects provide tantalizing hints at the symbolic sophistication of the Merovingians, suggesting that their artifacts were more than decorative. They were part of a coded system of authority, conveying legitimacy, sacredness, and perhaps even esoteric knowledge. Scholars who study these items note recurring symbols, intertwined geometric patterns, motifs resembling ancient solar symbols, and iconography reminiscent of earlier Celtic and Germanic traditions. Each artifact becomes a potential key, a piece of a puzzle that may reveal how the Merovingians understood themselves and the power they wielded. The geographic spread of these relics is also significant. Many are linked to regions that were central to the early Frankish kingdom, modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany, but some appear in areas that suggest broader cultural connections. This raises questions about the extent of the Merovingians' influence and the networks they may have maintained, whether political, spiritual, or symbolic. The presence of similar motifs across distant sites hints at a deliberate effort to create a recognizable visual language of authority, one that could transcend immediate political boundaries and embed itself in the consciousness of their subjects. Equally intriguing are reports of relics that may contain or symbolize genetic or biological elements. Some chroniclers hint at objects associated with sacred blood or hair, preserved in ceremonial context to maintain continuity of the dynasty's sacred essence. While modern science has yet to confirm the existence of such items, these stories align with a broader pattern of Merovingian ritual, a dynasty intensely concerned with lineage, inheritance, and the preservation of sacred authority. The idea that blood or genetic material could be encoded, preserved, or symbolically represented in physical artifacts contributes to the enduring mystery that surrounds this dynasty, suggesting that the Merovingians were as sophisticated in their esoteric practices as they were in their politics. The fascination with lost Merovingian artifacts continues to inspire both scholarship and speculation. Researchers comb archives, private collections, and historical sites in the hope of locating fragments that might illuminate the dynasty's rituals, beliefs, or lineage. Some pursue these discoveries with academic rigor, others with esoteric or even mystical intent, seeking connections to hidden knowledge or lost wisdom. In all cases, the survival or disappearance of these relics underscores a key theme. The Merovingians' power was inseparable from their symbols. To erase the dynasty politically was not enough. Controlling, hiding, or destroying these artifacts was necessary to contain the influence of a line perceived as sacred. In the end, the story of the Merovingian relics is a story of continuity and concealment. Even as political power shifted, even as dynasties rose and fell, the artifacts persisted, hidden or transformed, echoing the sacred authority of a dynasty that could not be fully erased. Each object, each manuscript, each surviving symbol carries with it the weight of history, myth, and secrecy, reminding us that the Merovingians were more than kings. They were custodians of a legacy encoded in both blood and object, a legacy that continues to captivate, intrigue, and challenge the boundaries between history and mystery. For centuries, the Merovingians existed largely in the realm of legend, their sacred bloodline inferred from myths, chronicles, and esoteric texts. But in recent years, the rise of modern genetics has offered an unprecedented lens through which to examine their story. The year 2025 has brought new revelations. DNA studies performed on remains believed to belong to Merovingian rulers have begun to provide a glimpse into the lineage that has long been shrouded in secrecy. These findings, while preliminary, are extraordinary, not merely for what they tell us about ancestry, but for the way they intersect with the myths, symbols, and prophecies that have persisted for more than a millennium. The process began with the exhumation of remains attributed to Merovingian kings and nobles, carefully preserved in crypts and burial sites throughout northern France. Advanced genomic sequencing allowed scientists to reconstruct parts of the family tree, tracing paternal and maternal lines and identifying genetic markers that were unusually consistent among the tested remains. While skeptics caution that verifying the authenticity of ancient DNA is always fraught with difficulty, the patterns observed were striking. They suggested a continuity across generations that aligned with historical records, but also hinted at anomalies, markers that hinted at lineages and connections previously unrecognized by conventional scholarship. One of the most compelling aspects of these findings is the potential link between Merovingian blood and older European and Near Eastern populations. Certain Y chromosome haplotypes, for example, appeared in individuals across regions that far exceeded the known political boundaries of the early Frankish kingdom. While this does not necessarily prove extraordinary ancestry, it does suggest that the Merovingians may have had connections through marriage, migration, or lineage that were broader than previously understood. These results, when paired with the legends of their divine or semi-mythical origin, raise questions about how much truth underlies centuries of mythologizing. The genetic evidence also resonates with the symbolism that has long surrounded the Merovingians. The sacred hair, the rituals, the Grail legends, all can be interpreted in a new light when considering that the dynasty may have carried distinctive biological markers. If hair was treated as a vessel of divine essence, as chroniclers and esoteric traditions suggest, then it is conceivable that some of this significance was based on real, observable differences in the lineage, differences that were preserved and revered, even if they were never fully understood in biological terms. In this sense, the myths and rituals may have been attempts to encode and protect knowledge about inheritance long before the advent of modern genetics. Perhaps most provocative is the question of survival. If Merovingian markers persist in ancient remains, could they survive in modern populations as well? Researchers have begun to explore this, comparing known Merovingian markers with those found in certain aristocratic families across Europe. While results are tentative and require careful validation, some correlations have emerged that suggest continuity is possible. This does not mean the bloodline has wielded overt political power in modern times, but it does imply that the lineage may not be as extinct as conventional history suggests. The possibility of living descendants adds a tangible dimension to legends that were once considered purely metaphorical. The implications extend beyond genealogy. DNA studies may also illuminate migration patterns, familial alliances, and even health or physiological traits that were passed through generations. In other words, the Merovingians were not only a symbolic or mystical dynasty, They were a biological lineage whose continuity can now be traced, in part, through the language of modern science. This convergence of history, legend, and genetics creates a rare moment in which ancient myths can be examined under the rigorous lens of empirical study without entirely losing their enigmatic qualities. The intersection of myth and DNA also revitalizes the Grail narrative. If the Grail is interpreted not as a physical object, but as a bloodline imbued with sacred or esoteric significance, then the discovery of tangible genetic continuity reinforces centuries of legend. The sacred inheritance once preserved through ritual, symbols, and prophecy may have left a biological trace, giving modern science a way to confirm, reinterpret, or at least contextualize stories that were long dismissed as fantasy. In this light, the Merovingians emerge not as purely mythical figures, but as actors in a real historical drama whose resonance extends into the present. At the same time, the findings raise cautionary questions about secrecy and interpretation. Ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to authenticate, and contamination or misattribution can skew results. Critics argue that linking genetic markers to the mystical claims of the Merovingians risks conflating science and legend, turning speculation into pseudoscience. Yet even skeptics acknowledge that the very act of testing these remains opens a door that was previously closed, offering an opportunity to explore questions that have lingered for centuries. Who are the Merovingians? Really? How far did their lineage extend? And what truths lie behind the elaborate rituals, the sacred symbols, and the enduring legends that have fascinated historians, mystics, and storytellers alike? The 2025 DNA revelations thus mark a pivotal moment in the study of the Merovingians. They transform the discussion from abstract speculation into a field where science and history converge, offering empirical data to examine a lineage once thought to exist only in myth. Yet the results also preserve the aura of mystery. Genetic markers provide evidence, but they cannot fully explain the cultural, symbolic, or spiritual weight carried by the dynasty. The Merovingians remain, in many ways, a bridge between the tangible and the intangible, a line of kings whose story can be traced in bones and genes, yet whose power continues to echo in legend, ritual, and prophecy. For scholars, mystics, and curious minds alike, the implications are profound. DNA does not merely confirm existence. It reshapes understanding. It allows us to ask new questions about inheritance, sacred lineage, and the interplay between biological reality and cultural perception. The Merovingians, long hidden behind layers of myth, suppression, and mystery, are beginning to emerge in a form that is both scientific and symbolic, a dynasty whose essence, encoded in blood and preserved across centuries, may finally reveal secrets that have waited over 1,000 years to be understood. The modern fascination with the Merovingian dynasty has always hovered between archaeology, folklore, and esoteric speculation, but the events of 2025 pushed this mystery into a new era. For the first time, academic institutions, independent researchers, and genetic laboratories converged on a single question. Could the legendary rulers of early medieval Gaul have left behind a distinct genetic signature? And if so, what would this reveal about their true origins, their supposed sacred lineage, and the long-standing rumors of an unusual ancestry described in both medieval chronicles and occult literature? The story began with a series of excavations in northeastern France, a region dense with Merovingian burial grounds. Several graves previously attributed to the 6th and 7th centuries were reopened, not for the purpose of reinterpreting traditional history, but to apply modern genomic tools unavailable during earlier digs. What emerged was a carefully coordinated project to gather viable genetic material from remains long thought too degraded to yield meaningful information. Advances in ancient DNA extraction techniques changed that assumption almost overnight. Bone fragments from femurs, teeth preserved in clay soil, and small remnants of hair and textile fibers all became potential keys to unlocking a 1,500-year-old biological record. Researchers initially approached the project with cautious neutrality. The goal was simply to reconstruct the genomes of individuals believed to have belonged to Merovingian aristocracy. Yet, as results began to surface, the tone of the study shifted dramatically. Preliminary findings suggested these individuals formed an unexpectedly coherent genetic cluster. Their shared markers traced not only to common Frankish and Germanic populations, but also hinted at influences from regions farther east and south, stirring immediate academic debate. What drew even greater attention was the presence of certain rare haplogroups, lineages not commonly associated with early medieval Western Europe. Some geneticists proposed that these markers reflected long-distance migrations linked to late Roman military auxiliaries or early tribal movements across the Rhine. Others suggested more mysterious origins, raising eyebrows among historians already familiar with the mythic conception of Merovec, the dynasty's semi-legendary founder who is said to be born of both a Frankish king and a creature of the sea. While no responsible scientist claimed genetic evidence of anything supernatural, the unusual blend of ancestry sparked discussions among esoteric researchers who saw the data as, at minimum, symbolically aligned with Merovingian lore. The scientific teams involved attempted to keep their focus narrow, yet the media environment of 2025 made it impossible to contain speculation. Leaks from within a European university hinted that portions of the sequencing had been withheld due to interpretation concerns. Statements like these fueled online theories, claiming the results either contradicted accepted narratives of Merovingian ethnogenesis or perhaps revealed a lineage linked to groups long associated with biblical or Near Eastern traditions. Some speculated connections to ancient priestly families, others to the remnants of late Roman elites, and a few even proposed ties to obscure Near Eastern tribes mentioned in early Christian apocrypha. Meanwhile, institutional voices urged caution. The European Genetic Heritage Council released carefully worded briefings explaining that ancient DNA studies are notoriously prone to contamination, misalignment, and statistical noise. Yet critics pointed out that none of the official statements directly addressed the unusual haplogroups reported in early drafts of the study. Instead, the public was told to await full publication, a phrase that in the world of suppressed history only deepened suspicion. Independent researchers stepped into the vacuum. Using publicly available datasets and fragments of leaked results, they attempted to reconstruct the broader picture. Some claimed that the Merovingian individuals demonstrated a hybrid lineage combining early Germanic ancestry with influences more typical of Mediterranean and possibly Levantine populations. This sparked renewed interest in centuries-old legends tying the bloodline to early Christian sects, desert mystics, and even rumored survivors of lost tribes. Although mainstream scholars dismissed these interpretations as speculative overreach, the timing of the leaks, paired with the fragmented nature of official communication, created fertile ground for alternative explanations. Archaeological context added another layer of intrigue. Several artifacts recovered from the burial sites included symbols and decorations not commonly found in other Frankish graves of the period. Intricate patterns resembling early Christian iconography, hints of Mediterranean trade objects, and strange seven-pointed star designs carved into combs and metal fittings revived long-standing interpretations that the Merovingians possessed esoteric knowledge that diverged from later medieval orthodoxy. These artifacts alone did not prove anything definitive, but when viewed alongside the DNA results, they created a narrative tension between what was being scientifically uncovered and what institutions seemed reluctant to openly discuss. By mid-2025, as pressure mounted, a partial report was released, one that many critics argued was too tidy, too generalized, and too sanitized to represent the full scope of the findings. It confirmed the presence of shared genetic traits among the individuals tested and acknowledged a complex ancestral origin, blending Northern European and Mediterranean components. But it omitted key details about the more anomalous markers. Footnotes hinted at ongoing analyses and further research required, which only fueled speculation that the full truth had not been presented. As debates intensified, a counter-narrative emerged. Some argued that the controversial markers were in fact statistical artifacts caused by poor preservation and environmental contamination. Others pointed to the possibility of intermarriage between Merovingian elites and high-status individuals from distant regions, a practice not uncommon among early medieval ruling families seeking alliances across the decaying remnants of the Roman world. But even this explanation raised questions. Why would certain lineages appear concentrated within particular graves, suggesting not accidental mingling, but a preserved and protected familial line? The tension reached a symbolic peak when several independent labs claimed that early results indicated a surprisingly high degree of internal continuity within the Merovingian genetic dataset. In other words, these individuals were more genetically similar to one another than expected, possibly indicating intentional preservation of a bloodline across generations. To some, this reinforced the traditional view of Merovingians as an aristocratic family maintaining strict lineage control. To others, it supported the esoteric idea of a protected, sacred line deliberately maintained across centuries. Ultimately, the 2025 findings did not give a single definitive answer, but they undeniably opened a door. The Merovingian dynasty could no longer be viewed solely through the lens of medieval chronicles and church-approved histories. For the first time, a biological window into their identity had appeared, and behind that window lay a puzzle far older and more intricate than historians expected. Whether the anomalies were the result of ancient migrations, aristocratic intermarriage, or something more mysterious, the genetic revelations reshaped the conversation. They suggested that behind the legends of the long-haired kings, behind the whispered stories of sacred ancestry, and behind the medieval attempts to erase this dynasty from power, something unusual had been present all along, something that, even now, refuses to be easily explained. The attempt to trace the Merovingian legacy across medieval Europe is not merely a genealogical exercise. It is a journey into the quiet, hidden channels through which power, memory, and bloodlines move beneath the surface of recorded history. After the 2025 DNA studies raised the possibility of a distinct Merovingian genetic identity, researchers and enthusiasts turned their attention to the centuries that followed the dynasty's political fall. If the bloodline survived, it would not have remained in plain sight. Instead, it would have traveled silently, woven into the nobility, shaping alliances, and influencing families who themselves may have lost awareness of their ancient origins. The first step in this exploration involves understanding the nature of medieval noble families. Lineages during the Middle Ages were far less isolated than modern assumptions allow. Marriages were carefully arranged for political gain, territorial expansion, and social stability. This created a complex web of interconnections across France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. If Merovingian descendants did persist through private or unofficial lines, they would likely have been absorbed into these same networks, where their influence could endure across generations without appearing overtly on the stage of formal history. One of the earliest possible conduits is the region of Austrasia, the heartland of the Merovingian realm. After the Carolingians took control, many aristocratic families in this region continued to hold local power, even while paying allegiance to new kings. These families, some documented, many not, formed a potential shelter for surviving branches. Records show that certain noble houses of Lotharingia, the Rhineland, and Lorraine claimed vague descent from ancient kings, or the first rulers of the Franks, without specifying names. Whether due to genuine lineage or medieval embellishment, these claims align intriguingly with geographies once under Merovingian influence. Another trail emerges in Burgundy and Provence, where old aristocratic lines preserve detailed genealogies that sometimes reach back to the early medieval period. In these regions, scholars have noted the presence of distinctive naming patterns reminiscent of Merovingian royal traditions. Names like Sigebert, Theudebert, and Dagobert reappear sporadically across centuries. While naming alone cannot prove ancestry, the persistence of unusual royal names suggests cultural memory, or at least pride in association with an ancient lineage. Some families in these regions later became key players in crusader movements, church politics, and monastic patronage, areas often linked by modern researchers to hidden Merovingian or Grail lore. The trail becomes more intriguing when examining the noble families connected to the Knights Templar. During the height of the Templars' influence, several European houses forged deep ties with the order through donations, shared estates, and marital alliances. Among them, a few possessed legends of descending from the first kings of the Franks, a phrase that has long been interpreted as a subtle reference to Merovingian ancestry. Though impossible to confirm, such families include branches in Champagne, Flanders, and Languedoc, regions historically saturated with Grail legends, Cathar mysteries, and cryptic references to sacred bloodlines. Genealogists have also explored lines that extended into Iberia. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and later during the Reconquista, numerous French noble families migrated into northern Spain, bringing with them their ancestral histories. Some of these Iberian families exhibit unexpected genetic markers that resemble those found in early medieval Gaul. Whether these markers represent Merovingian influence or merely broader Frankish migrations remains a matter of debate. Still, the convergence of genetic, linguistic, and cultural indicators raises the possibility that the bloodline may have reached far beyond the traditional boundaries of Merovingian rule. Another point often noted by independent researchers involves the marriage alliances of early medieval queens. Some noble women believed to be Merovingian heirs, especially those connected to Dagobert II's rumored surviving line, were said to have married into smaller noble houses that later ascended to prominence. If these stories hold even fragments of truth, it could help explain unusual genetic patterns appearing centuries later in unexpected regions, including Italy and Austria. Medieval Europe was fluid, and elite families often moved across territories as fortunes rose or fell. Beyond genealogical speculation, the genetic data itself provides an avenue for exploration. Modern computational models allow researchers to track how a distinct lineage could disperse through a population over many centuries. If the Merovingians possessed certain unique markers, and if even a small number of descendants survived after their deposition, these markers could quietly propagate through noble and common populations alike. Over time, the lineage would not disappear, it would diffuse. Across the long arc of European esoteric history, few themes appear as consistently and as mysteriously as the belief in a sacred or chosen bloodline. Whether encoded in secret doctrines, hidden in ritual hierarchies, or whispered through centuries of initiatory lore, many occult orders preserve some reference to a lineage that predates medieval Christendom and stands apart from the sanctioned royal houses of Europe. When researchers began probing these traditions more deeply, one name surfaced again and again: the ancient dynasty that ruled the early Frankish world, the one whose origins seemed to hover between history and myth, the Merovingians. To understand why so many esoteric groups found significance in this early medieval family, one must first recognize what these secretive orders value. They are drawn to continuity, symbolism, and hidden meaning. The Merovingian dynasty, shrouded in legends of divine kingship, unusual origins, and a deliberate mystique, offered all three. For many of these groups, the Merovingians represented not merely a lineage of kings, but a vessel of spiritual authority, a thread of ancient wisdom woven into the political fabric of early Europe. Some of the earliest esoteric references to the bloodline emerged in medieval and early Renaissance manuscripts associated with the Rosicrucians. While mainstream scholarship views Rosicrucianism as a symbolic movement, its inner traditions speak cryptically of keepers of the dawn lineage and heirs of the primal kings. Though never named directly, the descriptions of geographical origin, physical traits, and ritual symbolism align closely with Merovingian lore. The Rosicrucian rose, often drawn with hidden geometries, mirrors designs carved onto Merovingian-era artifacts, while their emphasis on sacred kingship echoes the dynasty's own spiritual claims. Gnostic-inspired groups, particularly those that flourished in southern France before the Albigensian Crusade, also preserved hints of an extraordinary lineage tied to ancient wisdom. Some Cathar texts allude to a line of the righteous kings, whose authority derived not from the church, but from a deeper, pre-Christian source. These references are rare and fragmentary, but their presence in regions once associated with Merovingian power is difficult to ignore. Later esoteric revivals in those same areas, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, seized upon these fragments, interpreting them as evidence that the early medieval rulers had maintained a spiritual tradition later suppressed by orthodox institutions. Another thread emerges in the labyrinth of European Templar traditions. Although the historical Knights Templar left limited written doctrine, later groups claiming Templar heritage developed intricate mythologies. Among them was the idea that the Templars guarded not only relics and treasures, but genealogical secrets. Some modern esoteric orders rooted in Neo-Templar traditions insist that the Templars preserve knowledge of a royal bloodline that predated the Carolingian takeover. In these circles, the Merovingians represent the true kings, unjustly displaced and spiritually superior to those crowned by ecclesiastical authority. One intriguing aspect of these orders is their frequent use of symbols associated with Merovingian mythology. The bee, for example, a creature linked to regeneration, wisdom, and eternal return, appears repeatedly in both Merovingian tombs and esoteric iconography. Modern occult groups that revere the bee as a sacred emblem often claim, either subtly or explicitly, that they are honoring an ancient lineage. Likewise, the fleur-de-lis, though widely known as a symbol of later French monarchy, appears in Merovingian contexts long before it became associated with the Capetians. In esoteric doctrine, it is interpreted not merely as a heraldic symbol, but as a sign of blood purity, divine authority, or a connection to forgotten mysteries. As centuries progressed, the lore surrounding the Merovingian bloodline became more intricate. Enlightenment-era secret societies, particularly those influenced by mystical or pseudo-historical theories, incorporated the idea of a suppressed royal house into their worldview. Some Masonic rites reference the first kings and those whose head was their crown, both veiled nods to the legendary long-haired rulers who claimed their uncut hair was a symbol of divine favor. These ritual phrases are intentionally cryptic, meant to convey a sense of continuity from an ancient wisdom tradition to modern initiates. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought an explosion of esoteric speculation that fused history, symbolism, and romantic nationalism. During this period, several occult groups formally asserted that the Merovingians preserved remnants of an ancient, possibly pre-Christian spiritual tradition, one that valued sacred kingship, intuitive knowledge, and a cosmic connection to nature. For these groups, the fall of the Merovingians represented not just a political shift, but a metaphysical loss, the replacement of a spiritually aligned dynasty with one more compatible with institutional church doctrine. Even more striking is how many of these groups linked the Merovingians to the concept of the Grail, whether understood as a physical relic, a metaphysical symbol, or a bloodline. In some interpretations, the Grail represents not a cup but a lineage, a vessel of sacred blood carried through generations. This idea, though speculative, became deeply influential in 20th century esoteric thought. Some orders incorporated genealogical charts into their teachings, suggesting that the Merovingians held ancient knowledge originating not in Europe but in the Eastern Mediterranean. These genealogical charts were rarely historically accurate, but they reflected the symbolic importance of the bloodline rather than strict historical fact. Even in the modern era, new esoteric groups, influenced by both historical research and the romanticism of older traditions, continue to reference the Merovingians in their teachings. Some portray the dynasty as keepers of forgotten knowledge related to astronomy, sacred geometry, or pre-Christian spirituality. Others suggest a more metaphysical connection, that the bloodline carries a specific frequency or spiritual resonance, unique to certain ancient kingships. These interpretations are not grounded in empirical evidence, yet they persist because they speak to a human fascination with continuity, secrecy, and the idea that certain families carry a destiny shaped by forces beyond ordinary understanding. What makes these recurring references particularly compelling is the consistency across time and geography. Rosicrucians, Gnostics, Neo-Templars, mystical Freemasons, and modern esoteric groups all point, whether explicitly or symbolically, to an ancient royal lineage with unusual origins and enduring significance. None of these traditions require historical accuracy for their beliefs to function. Instead, the Merovingian bloodline serves as a focal point for a deeper archetype, the hidden king, the rightful heir, the bearer of sacred knowledge lost to mainstream history. The persistence of the blood of kings doctrine across so many esoteric traditions suggests that the Merovingian dynasty occupies a symbolic role far beyond its historical borders. Whether grounded in reality or myth, the idea of a lineage imbued with spiritual potency continues to resonate, drawing new generations into the search for connections between ancestral memory, hidden wisdom, and the unseen patterns of European history. For centuries, the tension between the Church and the Merovingian legacy has smoldered beneath the surface of European history. To understand why the Church may have viewed this bloodline as a threat, one must look beyond the usual political explanations and examine the deeper ideological conflict at play. This was not merely a dispute over power. It was a quiet war between two competing visions of spiritual authority. One vision flowed from institutional hierarchy, doctrine, and ecclesiastical control. The other, attributed by many to the Merovingians, hinted at a more ancient, decentralized, and mystical understanding of kingship, one that the Church could never fully regulate. The earliest Christian writers described the Merovingians with an unusual mixture of respect and caution. Even after their conversion, these kings maintained practices and symbols that did not fit comfortably within Orthodox Christianity. Their belief in sacred kingship predates their baptism. They were thought to possess divine legitimacy through birth rather than ecclesiastical approval. Their long hair, treated almost as a sacred relic, became an enduring symbol of their perceived inheritance of power. In the eyes of church leaders who relied on the authority of sacraments, councils, and clerical mediation, such a claim represented a dangerous alternative, power granted not by the Church, but by destiny. As the centuries progressed, church chroniclers began subtly shifting the narrative. Texts once describing Merovingian rituals with admiration were rewritten or replaced, painting the kings as lazy, ineffective, or morally questionable. This reputation, later perpetuated by Carolingian propagandists, served an important function. By diminishing the Merovingians, the Church strengthened its alliance with their successors. But behind the political motives lay an older concern. Whispers persisted that the Merovingians retained elements of pre-Christian spiritual knowledge that blended Christian, pagan, and mystical traditions in ways the Church considered dangerously syncretic. Some medieval manuscripts hint at disagreement between Merovingian rulers and ecclesiastical authorities regarding the nature of kingship and spiritual inheritance. The Church viewed itself as the gatekeeper of divine truth, while the Merovingians appeared to embody a lineage believed, by their followers at least, to be chosen by God before the establishment of the Church. This tension can be seen in the complex relationship between the Merovingian kings and early bishops. On the surface, the two worked together. But beneath that cooperation lay subtle friction. Church leaders were wary of any form of power they could not fully control. The question of why the Merovingians were ultimately sidelined becomes clearer when examining this ideological tension. The Carolingian dynasty, which replaced them, aligned closely with the Church. Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope symbolized a new model of authority, a king legitimized not by ancient lineage, but by ecclesiastical blessing. This shift represented a profound redefinition of kingship and directly undermined the Merovingian claim to divine right. Yet, certain aspects of Merovingian culture proved more difficult to erase. Rumors persisted that the dynasty protected unorthodox texts, preserved early Christian writings deemed heretical, or maintained connections with fringe spiritual groups. Whether true or not, these rumors influenced how the Church responded to potential traces of the lineage long after the dynasty's political fall. During the Middle Ages, several councils targeted beliefs associated, sometimes mistakenly, with Merovingian-era spirituality. Certain mystical ideas, especially those connected to sacred kingship, reincarnation, and divine ancestry, were systematically suppressed. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this quiet conflict lies in the manuscripts censored or destroyed during the Carolingian reforms. Scholars have long noted that many Merovingian-era documents vanished or were rewritten between the 8th and 9th centuries. Some attribute this to the natural decay of old texts, but others argue that the Carolingians, with church support, streamlined historical narratives to strengthen their legitimacy. In doing so, they erased records that may have preserved details of Merovingian traditions, rituals, or beliefs that contradicted official doctrine. In later centuries, when esoteric societies began investigating ancient lineages, they too noticed the gaps. These missing records became fertile ground for theories that the Church had intentionally obscured aspects of Merovingian history. Whether the motivation was political, spiritual, or both, the result was a centuries-long ambiguity surrounding the dynasty. A few monks and chroniclers hinted at unapproved genealogies, disputed miracles, and forbidden rites linked to early Frankish kings. Their language was careful, but their meaning unmistakable. Something about the Merovingian legacy had been deemed dangerous enough to suppress. The conflict deepened when later heretic movements began emphasizing themes that echoed older Merovingian traditions. The Cathars' belief in dualism, the Templars' fascination with sacred lineage, and the mystical symbolism of early Gnostic groups all carried faint echoes of ideas attributed to the Merovingians. Although historical connections are speculative, the Church perceived many of these groups as spiritually subversive. The violent suppression of such movements may have indirectly reflected a lingering concern that remnants of an older, alternative Christian lineage, one potentially connected to the Merovingians, might resurface. In the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered ancient texts and questioned established authority, scholars and mystics began resurrecting interest in early royal bloodlines. Some writers, drawing from fragmentary sources, suggested that the Merovingians held esoteric insight into the nature of spiritual power. Their theories often described a lineage that bridged earthly and divine realms, a concept incompatible with Orthodox Christianity's emphasis on spiritual equality before God. These ideas were controversial, and the Church dismissed them as dangerous fantasies. But their persistence suggests they tapped into something deeply embedded in Europe's collective memory. By the modern era, the Church's stance toward alternative history softened, yet a noticeable reluctance remained whenever the Merovingians were discussed in esoteric or symbolic contexts. Scholars who attempted to explore the dynasty's alleged ties to mystical traditions often found limited support, scarce documentation, or archives with unexplained gaps. A few historians privately admitted that certain medieval records concerning early Frankish spirituality remained inaccessible or had been categorized as non-essential during past archival reforms. The question lingers: was the suppression intentional or merely the byproduct of shifting political alliances? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the two. The Church had compelling reasons to elevate dynasties it supported and downplay those it found unmanageable. In the process, the Merovingians, whose authority flowed from lineage rather than ecclesiastical approval, became inconvenient. Their mystique survived not because the Church preserved it, but because the Church attempted to obscure it. Mysteries thrive in silence, and the centuries-long effort to downplay the significance of the long-haired kings only amplified their aura. Today, the conflict between the Church's official history and the alternative narratives surrounding the Merovingians remains unresolved. What survives is not a clear record, but a shadow, a collection of hints, contradictions, missing texts, and suppressed symbols. Together, they suggest that the early Franks carried a legacy that diverged from the story the Church later shaped. Whether this legacy represents a spiritual tradition, an ancestral secret, or simply a forgotten cultural worldview, it continues to cast a long, enigmatic shadow over the history of Europe. The thread connecting the Merovingian legacy to the Cathars and the Knights Templar forms one of the most enigmatic intersections in European history. These three elements, an ancient royal bloodline, a persecuted mystical sect, and a powerful military order shrouded in secrecy, are seldom linked in mainstream scholarship. Yet, in the realm of alternative history and esoteric investigation, they appear not as separate stories, but as parts of a single, shadowed narrative, the survival of forbidden knowledge. To follow this path requires stepping into a region of France where the landscape itself seems shaped by secrets. The rugged hills, ruined castles, and hidden valleys of the Languedoc. This is the same region where, centuries after the Merovingian dynasty faded from view, new movements arose that bore uncanny echoes of the spiritual independence attributed to the ancient Frankish kings. The Cathars, who flourished in the 12th and early 13th centuries, represented a radical alternative to the Roman Church. Their teachings emphasized purity, dualism, and a direct, unmediated connection to the divine, ideas long suspected to descend from forgotten or suppressed early Christian sources. Whether these doctrines had any direct link to Merovingian spirituality is a matter of debate, but the resonance is striking. Both traditions resisted central ecclesiastical control. Both valued spiritual authenticity over institutional power, and both met fierce opposition from the Church. When the Church launched the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars, the violence was not only a military assault but a cultural erasure. Castles were seized, texts were burned, and entire communities were destroyed. Yet, through all the chaos, persistent whispers circulated among the doomed Cathar communities. Some insisted they were guardians of an ancient secret, something older than the Church, perhaps even older than Christianity itself. Medieval chroniclers, often hostile, described Cathar leaders speaking of a line of the just and a hidden history preserved by a chosen few. These descriptions, though vague, fueled later interpretations that the Cathars may have inherited remnants of Merovingian-era spiritual traditions. The destruction of the Cathars created a vacuum in the region, one soon filled by another group, the Knights Templar. Though the Templars were formally aligned with the Church, their activities in the Languedoc and their connections with local families have long raised questions among historians and esoteric researchers. When the Templars established fortified sites in the region, they inherited lands once occupied by Cathar nobles. Some researchers believe this was not a coincidence. The Templars had both the resources and the motivation to investigate any surviving remnants of Cathar lore, particularly if it related to hidden archives, relics, or genealogical secrets. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a wave of speculative scholarship suggested that the Templars may have discovered evidence of a surviving Merovingian bloodline while operating in the Languedoc. Though unproven, several pieces of circumstantial evidence support the possibility. Local traditions speak of Templar excavations beneath old Cathar sites. Medieval records describe certain Templar officials meeting privately with nobles from families rumored to possess unusual ancestry. And a handful of cryptic symbols, seven-pointed stars, beam motifs, and grail-like chalice shapes, appear in Templar architecture in the region, echoing symbols found in Merovingian burial art. The idea that the Templars might have protected a hidden lineage is not new. Some historians argue that their immense wealth and influence were not born solely from military and banking success, but from something more mysterious, possibly the safeguarding of knowledge or artifacts that gave them leverage far beyond what their official role should have provided. If the Templars possessed documents linking the Merovingians to early Christian or pre-Christian traditions, that alone could have threatened the Church's authority. It is no coincidence that when the Church eventually turned against the Templars, accusations of heresy played a central role. The Templars were not merely arrested. They were systematically dismantled and their archives seized or destroyed. The disappearance of the Templars' records has only intensified speculation. Some believe that before their downfall, key members of the order fled with crucial documents, possibly genealogical charts, coded manuscripts, or relics believed to contain biological material from ancient lines. A few fringe theories propose that these materials might have held early forms of lineage preservation, symbolic or literal. While such claims cannot be proven, they persist because they offer an elegant explanation for the fierce secrecy and sudden political reaction the Templars faced. The trail of the Templars, however, is not the end of this lineage. In southern France, regions once governed by Cathar lords became fertile ground for later legends involving hidden treasure, lost books, and underground networks of guardians. Stories of knights who fled to remote valleys or carried secrets to mountain fortresses grew into a folklore that merged Templar and Cathar memory. It is in these legends that hints of a Merovingian connection resurface. Certain Languedoc families, long known for their resistance to outside authority, claimed quietly, privately, that they descended from kings predating the Carolingians. These claims were never formalized, yet they lingered across generations. In the 20th century, researchers drawn to Grail lore and sacred lineage theories revisited the region. They noted that many of the same villages associated with Cathar resistance and Templar refuge also contain peculiar traditions about ancient kings, hidden heirs, and holy families wandering in secret. Such stories are easily dismissed as rural folklore, yet their consistency across time and geography is remarkable. Families who had no contact with each other repeated versions of the same narrative. A royal line wronged by the Church, protected by warrior monks, and preserved by local nobles who swore oaths never to reveal its full story. The convergence of these elements, Cathars, Templars, Merovingians, forms a tapestry of mystery rather than a linear historical chain. Each group carries themes of resistance to centralized authority, preservation of hidden knowledge, and connections to spiritual traditions outside Orthodox doctrine. The Languedoc, with its rugged landscapes and ruined fortresses, becomes the stage upon which these stories overlap. Whether the connections are literal or symbolic matters less than the fact that they endure. The region itself seems to remember something, even if the official records do not. Today, the Southern Arc stands as a living testament to this layered history. Its silent castles, ancient pathways, and forgotten monasteries continue to draw historians, mystics, and seekers alike. The possibility that the Merovingian legacy flowed through the Cathars was investigated by the Templars and was quietly preserved by families who carried fragments of forgotten lineage, whether genetic, spiritual, or purely symbolic, remains one of the most compelling mysteries in European esoteric tradition. By the time the story reaches the 20th and now the 21st century, the Merovingian mystery has transformed from a nearly forgotten medieval footnote into one of the most discussed and speculated upon enigmas in alternative history circles. The shift began quietly. A handful of researchers in the early 1900s noticed unusual inconsistencies in official genealogical charts and strange omissions in medieval annals. But the modern explosion of interest came later, when a series of controversial documents surfaced, papers that claimed to trace an unbroken bloodline from the Merovingian kings all the way into contemporary Europe. These documents, often referred to as the Priory Papers or the Dossier's Secrets, ignited an international fascination. Though the authenticity of the papers remains disputed, their influence is undeniable. They described a secretive brotherhood operating across centuries, allegedly dedicated not only to preserving Merovingian heritage, but to protecting descendants who live quietly among modern society. Whether these documents were an elaborate hoax or a fragment of genuine suppressed history is still debated. But they introduced a new concept into the public imagination, the possibility that the Merovingian line never died. It simply went underground. This idea resonates particularly strongly with the broader world of esoteric knowledge, where ancient bloodlines, holy families, and hidden genealogies play central roles. When researchers dug deeper into the symbolism connected to the Merovingians, the bees, the fleur-de-lis, the long hair as a mark of spiritual power, they realized these symbols did not entirely disappear after the dynasty was overthrown. They persisted across European heraldry, architecture, and ritual symbolism for centuries. The question began to grow. Were these symbols mere artistic echoes or deliberate, encoded reminders designed to signal continuity? At the same time, developments in modern genetics opened new avenues of inquiry. The mapping of human DNA created the possibility, at least theoretically, that ancient dynasties could be identified through certain markers passed along the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. Some researchers wondered whether families with legends of Merovingian descent might show unusual genetic patterns. Of course, official mainstream historians largely dismiss these ideas, arguing that medieval genealogical claims are too muddled, too mythologized, and too incomplete to be verified scientifically. Yet despite skepticism, the pursuit continues. A number of private genealogical groups claim to have traced lineages that align suspiciously well with Merovingian descent. These families, often based in France, Belgium, and certain parts of Switzerland, maintain collections of old letters, seals, and codices passed down through generations, documents rarely seen by the public. Some members insist they carry an ancient responsibility, handed down quietly. Preserve the truth until the world is ready. Whether symbolic or literal, these families guard something that feels older than their own names. The fascination intensified further when fragments of long-lost medieval manuscripts were discovered in various European archives. These fragments did not openly identify any surviving monarch, but they hinted at political negotiations between the church and certain noble families during the 10th and 11th centuries. Negotiations concerning what was described cryptically as the rightful inheritance of the first kings. Scholars who examined these manuscripts publicly dismissed the references as metaphorical or theological. But independent researchers argued that the language, though coded, suggested discussions about lineage intentionally concealed. Modern conspiracy theories sometimes exaggerate these threads, weaving them into elaborate narratives involving global organizations, coded rituals, and world-shifting agendas. Yet beneath the exaggeration lies a quieter, more grounded set of questions. Why did certain medieval families guard documents with such secrecy? Why were the Merovingians erased so thoroughly? And why do hints of their name reappear in strange places, in esoteric societies, in occult symbolism, in fringe genealogical charts, and even in whisper networks among European aristocracy? Part of the renewed interest comes from the digital age itself. The internet has allowed scattered fragments, old scans, forgotten references, obscure academic papers, to be collected and compared by amateur researchers around the globe. Patterns that once required a lifetime of travel and study can now be examined by anyone with curiosity and persistence. Every few years, new threads emerge. A previously unknown gravesite with Merovingian artifacts, a rediscovered Latin manuscript referencing a family preserved, or DNA tests revealing anomalies in regions associated with Merovingian migration routes. Some researchers focus on physical evidence, bones from 6th and 7th century burials. In rare cases, these remains have been studied using modern forensic techniques, revealing certain genetic signatures common among early Frankish elites. But without a verified living descendant for comparison, it is difficult to build a definitive lineage. Still, the possibility lingers that one day such a comparison could be made, perhaps accidentally. A routine genealogical DNA test, a match flagged in a database, a pattern that stands out as ancient, specific, and unmistakable. Others investigate the philosophical and spiritual legacy. They point out that the Merovingians ruled not just through political power, but through an aura of sacred authority. Their kingship was tied to a mystical understanding of the divine, an idea threatening to the later church, which preferred centralized doctrine over decentralized spiritual authority. In this light, the suppression of the Merovingians becomes more than political. It becomes ideological. And if any trace of that sacred worldview survived, through Cathars, Templars, or hidden families, it would explain centuries of secrecy. In recent years, the topic has gained fresh energy as new archaeological tools, LiDAR scanning, DNA extraction from ancient manuscripts, high-precision dating, have revealed clues once invisible to historians. In France, researchers detected underground anomalies beneath several Merovingian-era sites, suggesting sealed chambers or forgotten crypts. In one location, strange metallic signals were detected beneath a basilica long associated with early Frankish rulers. Though no excavation has been approved, the discovery fuels speculation. Could lost tombs remain untouched? Could artifacts, perhaps even genetic material, still lie in the darkness? Meanwhile, journalists occasionally stumble upon unusual cases. Individuals in rural France or Belgium with rare genetic markers. Individuals whose families refuse interviews. Individuals whose heritage appears curated. These reports are often dismissed as sensationalism, but they add a strange texture to the broader tapestry. And then there are the esoteric societies. Though most operate quietly, their symbols, rites, and internal histories occasionally leak to the outside world. Surprisingly often, these references point back to the early medieval period, to bees, to sacred kingship, to hidden heirs. Not openly, not explicitly, but in fragments, in allegories, in carefully coded phrases. One group refers to the first light of the West. Another speaks of the sleeping line. A third preserves a motto: that which was cut shall rise again. None of these statements prove anything, yet all of them echo the same idea, that something was preserved, not lost. As the world approaches 2025, interest in these mysteries is at an all-time high. Conferences, documentaries, forums, and underground archives continue to grow. Some believe that new discoveries, genetic, archaeological, or symbolic, may bring us closer than ever to unraveling the truth. Others believe the truth is already known by a few, quietly protected, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Whatever the reality, the Merovingian question has become more than a historical inquiry. It has become a mirror. It reflects humanity's desire to trace origins, to understand forgotten inheritances, to uncover what lies beneath the surface of official history. And in the shadows of Europe's ancient landscapes, the feeling persists that the story is not finished, that the bloodline, whether literal or metaphorical, still pulses somewhere in the world today. As we enter the final arc of this sprawling mystery, the threads of the Merovingian story begin converging into a modern landscape shaped by technology, geopolitics, digital archives, and new scientific capabilities. What was once a medieval enigma, shrouded in crumbling manuscripts and forgotten abbeys, has now stepped quietly into the contemporary world, adapting to new tools while remaining wrapped in the same old secrecy. The question that now emerges is no longer merely historical. It becomes immediate and unsettling. If the Merovingian bloodline survived, where is it today? Who protects it? And why does the subject seem to resurface every time humanity reaches a new threshold of discovery? The surge of interest in ancestral DNA testing has created a global database unlike anything in history. Millions of people routinely submit their genetic information to private companies, often unaware of how deeply such data can penetrate into genealogical structures. This has sparked curiosity among alternative historians who speculate that if a Merovingian lineage truly persisted into the present day, it might unintentionally appear in these systems, perhaps as a unique haplogroup cluster concentrated in regions associated with Merovingian refuge. While no official discovery has been published, a few independent genetic enthusiasts have reported anomalies, clusters of markers unusually common in rural pockets of northeastern France and Belgium, areas often historically linked to Frankish nobility. Such claims remain unverified, yet they fuel a growing belief that the truth might be closer than ever. Researchers argue that if a single verified Merovingian relic, perhaps a funerary bone fragment, could be DNA matched to a modern individual, the results would rewrite the genealogical history of Europe. However, museums and churches guarding Merovingian tombs have historically denied access to genetic sampling, citing preservation concerns and ethical restrictions. Some suspect another motive, preventing a discovery that could destabilize long-accepted narratives about European dynastic legitimacy. At the same time, a different kind of evidence emerges from digital archaeology. Lost documents once hidden in private collections or dusty archives are increasingly scanned, indexed, and analyzed using machine learning tools. In recent years, several text recognition algorithms identified peculiar references in medieval clerical records, subtle hints that certain noble families, particularly in Burgundy and the Lower Rhine, possessed inherited rights predating the empire. Though written in cryptic ecclesiastical language, the implication is clear enough. Certain bloodlines may have been acknowledged, quietly and unofficially, as older than the Carolingian order that replaced the Merovingians. Adding to the intrigue are the scattered testimonies of individuals who claim, sometimes reluctantly, to descend from ancient Frankish lines. Most do not seek publicity. They live unremarkable lives, maintaining old traditions or guarding heirlooms that outsiders might view as mundane. But occasionally, one speaks, and the pattern they describe is familiar. Inherited silence, coded family symbols, genealogical charts missing key links, but always pointing backward toward a fragment of early medieval Europe. Some describe elders giving cautious warnings. Never show this outside the family, or these are names no longer spoken. These accounts, though anecdotal, echo each other with uncanny consistency. Meanwhile, the esoteric societies that once existed in the shadows of European culture continue to operate, though more fragmented than in centuries past. A few have embraced modernity, digitizing their archives or quietly networking across continents. Within their internal teachings, one still finds references to the early kings of the Franks, to sacred rulers whose power derived from spiritual legitimacy rather than political force. Some groups maintain rituals that symbolically reenact the anointing of a mystical king, using language and iconography dating back to the 6th and 7th centuries. Whether these rites are remnants of ancient tradition or romantic reconstructions is unknown, but the lineage they honor is unmistakably Merovingian. Speculation turns more intense when examining contemporary European politics. Though democratic structures have replaced monarchies, the influence of old noble families has not entirely vanished. Some descendants of medieval aristocracy still hold considerable economic power, land, or cultural influence. Researchers wonder whether, hidden among these lineages, there might be families with Merovingian ancestry, families whose heritage is acknowledged privately but never publicly. The idea is not far-fetched. Throughout history, noble houses have often maintained genealogical secrets to protect themselves during political upheavals. A claim to a suppressed or controversial lineage could have been dangerous during many periods of European history. The modern world also introduces a new factor: geopolitical interest. Ancient lineage claims, once irrelevant in the face of nation-states, now intersect with cultural identity movements, heritage tourism, and even the economics of historical branding. If a Merovingian bloodline were revealed publicly, it would generate enormous influence, scholarly, cultural, and possibly political. Some believe this potential impact is precisely why the truth, if it exists, remains veiled. Too many institutions, both secular and ecclesiastical, have invested centuries in the narrative that Europe's legitimate royal lineage began with the Carolingians, not the Merovingians. Then there is the digital underworld, forums, encrypted archives, anonymous researchers exchanging findings and fragments. Some claim to possess scans of rare documents referencing a sang real, a phrase often interpreted as royal blood. Others circulate alleged genealogical charts mapping obscure European families back to Dagobert II, the last Merovingian king said by some to have survived his assassination. Most of these documents are debated, contested, or dismissed as forgeries. But even if 9 out of 10 are false, the 10th could contain a sliver of truth. And that possibility drives the community's relentless curiosity. A strange pattern has also emerged in recent decades. Sudden closures of private archives, unexplained retractions of academic papers, and sealed court cases involving inheritance disputes within old European families. While these incidents may have mundane explanations, they often occur in regions deeply connected to Merovingian history. Researchers note the coincidence, though they are careful not to claim conspiracy, merely that something beneath the surface appears to be shifting. At the same time, popular culture continues to amplify interest. Novels, films, and documentaries referencing hidden bloodlines have created a global audience eager to explore the mystery. This attention has a dual effect. It spreads awareness, but also buries truth beneath waves of exaggeration and myth. Amid the noise, genuine clues risk being overlooked or dismissed as fiction. Some historians lament that the topic has become too interesting, making serious research difficult. Others believe that popular exposure acts as a shield, bringing too much attention for any single group or institution to control the narrative. What becomes clear, however, is that the modern world is reaching a point where secrecy grows more fragile. DNA testing, digital archives, satellite scans, and global information networks are tools no medieval chronicler could have imagined. They erode shadows. They expose fragments. They link clues across continents. The Merovingian mystery, which once survived by disappearing into the folds of history, now faces a paradox. Surviving in an age where nothing stays hidden forever may prove harder than vanishing in the medieval past. And yet, amid all the technological advancement, the heart of the mystery remains profoundly human. It revolves around identity, origin, and inheritance, questions people have asked since the dawn of memory. Whether the Merovingian line continues physically, symbolically, or spiritually, its allure persists because it taps into a universal longing, the desire to know where we come from, what we have forgotten, and what stories were silenced before we were born. As the world moves closer to the next chapter of scientific discovery, one cannot help but feel that the Merovingian question is approaching a threshold. Something lies ahead, perhaps a revelation, perhaps another layer of obscurity. Either way, the past is no longer content to remain buried. The ancient kings seem to stir again, not in courts or cathedrals, but in data points, illuminated manuscripts, and whispered family histories resurfacing after centuries of silence. As the modern era accelerates, the Merovingian mystery enters a new and unexpected dimension, one shaped not only by physical evidence and historical fragments, but by psychological patterns, cultural memory, and the collective subconscious of civilizations. The story of an ancient royal line, displaced yet not extinguished, resonates across time because it reflects something lodged deep within human consciousness, an archetype of the lost king, the rightful ruler who vanishes from history, yet continues to shape it from the shadows. In myth, literature, folklore, and esoteric teachings, this archetype reappears again and again. And the Merovingian tale, with its blend of political betrayal, spiritual power, disappearance, and whispered survival, fits it almost perfectly. Across Europe, especially in regions once under Merovingian influence, you find remnants of stories that seem timeless. Stories of sleeping kings who will one day return, of guardians who protect hidden inheritances, of ancient bloodlines that survive in silence. These motifs appear in Celtic folklore, in early Christian legends, and in pre-Frankish myths embedded in the landscape itself. Some scholars believe these stories arose naturally, shaped by centuries of upheaval. Others suggest they may have served as protective veils, coded ways of preserving a lineage too vulnerable to be named openly. This archetypal layer is important because it helps explain why the Merovingian mystery refuses to die. Even when dismissed by academia, even when overshadowed by sensationalized fiction, it reemerges in new forms, as if fulfilling a psychological need for continuity with an ancient past. For some, the Merovingians represent a lost alternative to the centralized, hierarchical church structure that dominated medieval Europe. For others, they symbolize a forgotten path of sacred kingship, one rooted not in conquest or political power, but in spiritual legitimacy, an idea that continues to fascinate modern seekers disillusioned with contemporary systems. In this context, the concepts of memory and forgetting take on profound significance. Civilizations often choose to forget inconvenient truths, whether consciously or unconsciously. They bury them beneath layers of rewritten history, ritual silence, or institutional authority. But forgotten stories do not disappear. They crystallize beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. And when they do, They often carry an uncanny sense of recognition, as if they were never truly lost at all. The Merovingian mystery functions in this way. Its details, royal assassinations, sacred symbols, surviving heirs, hidden refuge, linger at the edges of historical consciousness, resurfacing whenever society enters a period of cultural transformation. The 19th century saw its reawakening through occult groups and esoteric manuscripts. The 20th century saw its reappearance through genealogical theories and coded documents. And the 21st century sees its resurgence through digital research, mass DNA databases, and global interconnectedness. Each era rediscovers the mystery in a form suited to its own technologies and anxieties. But the psychological dimension extends beyond collective memory into the realm of personal identity. For many people, ancestry is not merely a biological fact. It is a narrative anchor, a way of situating oneself within the vast tapestry of time. As modern life becomes increasingly fast, fragmented, and rootless, the appeal of ancient lineage grows stronger. It offers continuity, meaning, and belonging. This emotional hunger drives interest in the Merovingian story, motivating individuals to search through family archives, investigate forgotten heraldry, or explore distant genealogical connections. This desire also fuels the formation of modern groups, quiet, loosely connected circles of enthusiasts, genealogists, hermetic researchers, and descendants who believe they carry fragments of the old line. Some gather to share documents. Others meditate on symbolism. A few engage in rituals meant to connect them spiritually with ancestral memory. In these gatherings, the past is treated not as a set of facts to be proven, but as a living presence, an inheritance unfolding through intuition, synchronicity, and inner knowledge. One striking pattern observed among these groups is the emphasis on protection. Many feel that if the Merovingian lineage does still exist in some form, biological, spiritual, or symbolic, its concealment is not merely historical accident, but a necessary safeguard. They speak of cycles in human civilization, of eras when sacred knowledge must retreat into silence until the world is ready to receive it again. In this framework, the Merovingian line becomes not a political dynasty, but a vessel of forgotten wisdom, guarded across centuries by those entrusted with its memory. This perspective leads naturally into the realm of metaphysics. Some esoteric traditions claim the Merovingian kings carried a unique spiritual quality, an ability to mediate between the human world and the divine. Their long hair, often mentioned in historical texts, was said to symbolize this connection, functioning as a kind of antenna for sacred energy.